Senator from Utah.
I understand that Senator Schumer wants to speak here in a little while. I'll try to hurry my remarks as quick as I can. Madam President, I rise today to speak once again on the proposed IRS regulations targeting grassroots 501c4 organizations. I've already come to the floor to discuss this issue, and I expect I'll be here several more times in the coming months as these proposed rules continue to move through the regulatory pipeline at the IRS. The public comment period for these proposed regulations ends today. As of this morning, the IRS had received over 100,000 comments on this proposal, the vast majority of them negative. This is an all-time record, Madam President. In fact, the number is more than 5 times greater than the previous record for comments on a proposed IRS regulation. By contrast, the Keystone XL pipeline, another item of enormous public interest, received just over 7,000 comments. So with all this public attention, the obvious question is why? Why has this proposal generated so much criticism from the American people? And I think the answer is quite simple. The American people see this proposal for what it is, an attempt to silence this administration's critics and keep them on the sidelines of the democratic process. I'd like to just take a few minutes to describe in detail just what this regulation does. Under the Internal Revenue Code, a 501c4 organization is a nonprofit organization, the exempt purposes of which is the, quote, promotion of social welfare, unquote. The phrase promotion of social welfare has long been defined as, quote, promoting in some way the common good and general welfare of the people of the community, unquote, or, quote, bringing about civic betterments and social improvements, unquote. Such organizations may engage in political activity for or against candidates for public office so long as their primary activity falls under the category of promoting social welfare. Under current regulations, activities such as voter registration or get-out-the-vote drives are correctly treated as promoting social welfare, just like the distribution of voter guidelines outlining candidates' positions on issues that are, in the view of the organization, important to the public. The proposed regulations would recategorize these types of candidate-neutral activities as not consistent with the exempt purpose of promoting social welfare. This is important because over the past few days, in an effort to justify these regulations, the administration has communicated to members of Congress that it is not banning these types of activities. They're just putting them in different categories. But lost in their justifications are some important distinctions. It's easy to get lost in the weeds, which is probably what the administration is hoping for. So let's break this down. Traditionally speaking, in order to keep their tax-exempt 501c4 organizations have had to limit their involvement in quote-unquote political activities to around 49% or less of their overall activities. In other words, they can be directly involved in the political process so long as the majority of their activities are devoted to social welfare. What this proposed regulation would do is redefine the parameters of what is considered political activity, moving a number of activities from the social welfare category to the political category. And like I said, under this regulation, simply stating where candidates for public office stand on issues important to a specific 501c4 organization would be considered political activity. In fact, even mentioning a candidate's name in a communication within a specified period before an election, even if the communication does not say whether the organization supports or opposes the candidate, would be considered political activity. As I mentioned, the same can be said for voter registration drives or get-out-the-vote initiatives, even if the efforts are obviously and legitimately nonpartisan. Basically, this proposed regulation would instantly categorize so much run-of-the-mill behavior as partisan political activity that many existing 501c4 grassroots organizations would have to stop promoting their causes altogether. And that, Madam President, is precisely what the administration wants. They don't want 501c4s educating the public on the issues of the day or telling voters where candidates stand on political issues. Sure, they're fine with these groups promoting social welfare, so long as that promotion does not include criticism of this administration or its policies that are harmful to the general welfare of their communities. And it would be one thing if the IRS was an agency with clean hands when it came to dealing with critics of this administration, but as we've seen, Madam President, that's simply not the case. Indeed, over the last few years, we've seen a record of harassment and intimidation of conservative groups applying to the IRS for tax-exempt status. The agency is under investigation in 3 separate congressional committees for its actions in the run-up to the 2010 and 2012 elections. Put simply, the credibility and the political independence of the IRS are very much in question. A reasonable person would think that rather than further damaging the IRS's reputation, the administration would instead focus on rebuilding it in the aftermath of the targeting scandal. Sadly, there doesn't appear to be too many reasonable people working in the Obama administration, at least not when it comes to this set of issues. We need to call this what it is, an affront to free speech and the right of all American citizens to participate in the democratic process. This is an attempt by the administration to marginalize its critics and silence them altogether. Republicans have been very vocal in our opposition to this proposed regulation. We have spoken out on a variety of venues, but make no mistake, Madam President, it is not just Republicans and conservatives that oppose this new rule. A number of left-leaning organizations have spoken out against it as well. The ACLU, for example, submitted a scathing comment letter to the IRS, arguing that the proposed regulation would, quote, produce the same structural issues at the IRS that led to the use of inappropriate criteria in the selection of various charitable and social welfare groups for unfair scrutiny, unquote. The ACLU argued further that social welfare groups should be free to participate in the political process because that kind of participation, quote, is at the heart of our representative democracy, and to the extent it influences voters, it does so by promoting an informed citizenry, unquote. We've seen similar comments from groups like the Sierra Club. Leaders of labor unions have also publicly weighed in about the overly broad nature of the proposed regulation. Put simply, Madam President, when you have a proposal that is drawing unanimous opposition from Republicans in Congress and is being criticized by the ACLU and big labor, there's a pretty decent chance that it is not good policy. And quite frankly, that characterization is probably too charitable for this particular proposal. This proposed regulation needs to be stopped in its tracks, Madam President. Yesterday, the House of Representatives passed legislation that would do just that. If enacted, the House bill would delay the implementation of the proposal for a year. I am an original co-sponsor of the Senate companion bill to this legislation, which was introduced by Senators Flake and Roberts. Sadly, I think I know where my colleagues on the other side of the aisle stand on this issue, and I expect that those of us here in the Senate that support the right of all Americans to participate in the political process are likely to be disappointed with regard to this particular legislative effort. Still, even if this legislation dies here in the Senate, and I hope it does, that's not the end of the line. Earlier this month, when I came to the floor to talk about this issue, I called on IRS Commissioner Koskinen to use his authority to block these regulations. I expect him to do so. When questioned about this proposal, he has consistently deferred, usually saying that he was not the commissioner when it was drafted and published. Fine. But he's the commissioner now. However, now that he is the commissioner, he is in a position to stop the proposed regulation from going final and acquiring the force of law. This proposal cannot take effect unless Commissioner Koskinen personally approves and signs the final regulation clearance package. That being the case, I call on him today to do the right thing, to not sign it when it reaches his desk. In fact, he ought to decry it for what it is. In an ideal world, the administration would simply withdraw this proposal and leave this issue alone. However, we're not living in such a world. That being the case, if the administration continues its effort to push through this proposed rule, the IRS commissioner can and should use his authority to stop it from taking effect. After all, that is one reason why Congress gives the IRS commissioner a 5-year term. The commissioner is supposed to be above and free from political pressure when making decisions and implementing our nation's tax laws. In light of that fact, I want to implore Commissioner Koskinen to use the power he's been granted to restore the IRS's credibility and make it clear to the American people that his agency, the IRS, will no longer be used as simply another political arm of this or any future administration. I hope he'll do that, Madam President, because it's the right thing to do, and I'm calling on him to do it. I have a faith in Commissioner Koskinen. I believe he's an honest man. I don't think he has any other choice but to stop these obnoxious regulations that people from the left to the right consider to be breaches of free speech and wrong. I yield the floor.